Tonight, the question is no longer whether Washington and Iran are talking. The real question is whether the world is watching the beginning of a historic breakthrough, or the setup for an even more dangerous collapse. For years, the words United States and Iran have rarely appeared together without the shadow of crisis hanging over them. Nuclear fears, proxy conflicts, threats in strategic waterways. Decades of mistrust layered on top of decades of political damage. And yet now, suddenly, one statement has changed the tone of the conversation. Vice President J.D. Vance says President Donald Trump does not want a small deal with Iran. He wants what Vance calls a big deal. Not a temporary pause. Not a symbolic handshake. Not a narrow technical compromise. A big deal. One that, if it ever became real, could reshape the balance of power across the Middle East and far beyond. And that is exactly why this moment matters so much. Because when leaders stop talking about limited concessions and start talking about sweeping transformation, the stakes rise instantly. This is no longer just about uranium. It is no longer just about sanctions. It is no longer just about another round of diplomatic theater. It is about whether two governments that have spent generations distrusting each other can somehow force history in a different direction. And even more importantly, it is about what happens if they fail. J.D. Vance made the message clear during an event in Athens, Georgia on April 14th. According to him, President Trump wants an agreement in which Iran does not possess nuclear weapons, does not support armed groups, and allows its people to grow, prosper, and integrate into the global economy. On paper, that sounds like a vision big enough to transform the region. But in reality, every phrase in that offer carries enormous political weight. No nuclear weapons means the heart of the international dispute. No backing for armed groups means touching Iran's broader regional strategy. Integration into the global economy means a future that could look radically different from the one shaped by sanctions, isolation, and confrontation. It sounds bold. It sounds sweeping. Sounds almost impossibly ambitious. And that may be exactly why the story is becoming so explosive. Because here is the first twist. Vance is not presenting this as an abstract dream. He is presenting it as an active mission. He says the deal is not finished because Trump genuinely wants it. He says the talks will continue. He says he remains optimistic. And perhaps most striking of all, he says he believes Tehran also wants a deal, despite the decades of bad blood between the two countries. That optimism is powerful, but it is also risky, because optimism, in diplomacy, can either be the first signal of movement or the last calm moment before disappointment hits. Think about how unusual this is. The United States and Iran have not merely disagreed over policy. They have built entire political identities around mistrust. Every negotiation between them carries the memory of past betrayals, failed agreements, pressure campaigns, regional conflicts, and mutual accusations. So when Vance says he feels very optimistic, he is not saying the easy part is over. He is saying something much more dramatic. That both sides may still see enough value in a breakthrough to keep pushing through the distrust. That alone is significant. But what comes next may matter even more. Because Vance also admitted something crucial. The lack of trust between Washington and Tehran cannot be fixed quickly. And that sentence may be the most honest part of the entire story. In fact, it may be the most important. Big deals are not destroyed only by public hostility. They are often destroyed by the quieter problem underneath. Neither side truly believes the other will keep its word. That means every demand becomes harder, every promise becomes weaker, and every pause becomes suspicious. A negotiation can survive disagreement. What it struggles to survive is deep, permanent doubt. Now here is where the story begins to widen. Trump reportedly told the New York Post on April 14th that a new round of talks with Iran could happen in Pakistan within 2 days. That means this is not a distant possibility sitting on a shelf waiting for some undefined future. This is immediate, fast-moving, potentially urgent. And if that second round does happen, Vance is expected to continue leading the American delegation. He may be joined by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. That lineup tells us something important. This is not routine diplomatic maintenance. This is being treated as a top-tier political effort with major visibility and high-level involvement. But before anyone concludes that a breakthrough is around the corner, consider what happened during the first major round. The United States and Iran reportedly held around 21 hours of talks in Islamabad, Pakistan on April 11th, with the host country participating as well. 21 hours. That is not a casual exchange. That is not symbolic contact for the cameras. That is the kind of duration that suggests serious engagement, hard bargaining, and repeated attempts to bridge gaps. Yet after all that time, no agreement was reached on key issues. And those key issues were not minor procedural questions. They went straight to the core of the conflict. One of those issues was Iran's right to continue enriching uranium. The other involved control over the Strait of Hormuz. And suddenly, the scale of this story becomes impossible to ignore, because uranium enrichment is not just a technical subject for nuclear specialists. It is the dividing line between what one side calls sovereign rights and what the other side sees as a pathway to catastrophic risk. And the Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is one of the most strategically critical choke points on the planet, a passage tied directly to global energy security and international trade. When negotiations get stuck on uranium and Hormuz, they are not stuck on side issues. They are stuck on the very pillars that define leverage, security, and power. And that raises an unsettling question. If the first round lasted 21 hours and still could not resolve the biggest disputes, how realistic is a big deal, really? Is this the beginning of genuine progress? Or are both sides using the language of diplomacy while protecting red lines that make a real agreement nearly impossible? That tension is exactly what makes this story so compelling, because the public hears optimism. But underneath that optimism are landmines. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian added another layer on April 12th, saying he was ready to accept what he called a balanced and fair agreement to guarantee peace and long-term security across the region. On its face, that sounds encouraging. Balanced, fair, peace, security. These are the kinds of words negotiators use when they want to sound open without sounding weak. But Pezeshkian also said the major obstacle right now is what he described as double standards from the United States. And he emphasized that any deal can only happen if Washington respects international legal frameworks. That is not a minor complaint. That is Iran signaling that even if it is prepared to negotiate, it does not intend to negotiate on terms it views as one-sided or politically humiliating. This is where the story becomes more than a headline. It becomes a collision of narratives. The American message, as described by Vance, is that Iran must decisively commit not to develop nuclear weapons and must stop supporting armed groups. The Iranian message is that a deal is possible, but only if the United States acts within legal norms and abandons what Tehran sees as selective standards. In other words, both sides are still speaking the language of agreement, but they are defining the path to that agreement in very different ways. That gap is where deals either get crafted with extraordinary skill or shattered. And here is the part many people miss in stories like this. Negotiations are never only about demands. They are about domestic politics. Every leader at that table is also speaking to audiences back home. Trump needs to project strength, control, and the image of a dealmaker who can deliver what others could not. Vance needs to show discipline and confidence while managing expectations. Iran's leadership must avoid appearing to surrender sovereignty, especially on a subject as politically charged as uranium enrichment. And each side knows that even a well-designed compromise can collapse if it looks too generous to the other side in the eyes of its own public. So when Vance says Trump wants a big deal, that phrase does not only describe diplomatic ambition. It also sets a political trap, because a big deal sounds impressive, but it also raises expectations dramatically. If talks produce only a narrow framework, critics may call it weak. If talks drag on without a breakthrough, critics may call it empty theater. And if talks fail after being framed as a major opportunity, the disappointment could intensify future confrontation rather than reduce it. In other words, the bigger the promise, the harsher the fallout if it breaks apart. And then there is the timing. According to the article, A ceasefire arrangement between the United States and Iran is set to expire in 1 week. That detail changes the emotional temperature of everything. Because now diplomacy is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening against a clock. The closer a deadline gets, the more every meeting feels urgent, every statement feels strategic, and every misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Deadlines can force movement, but they can also force miscalculation. Sometimes leaders compromise under pressure. Sometimes they harden their positions because they believe the other side is bluffing. And sometimes, right when the world expects calm, the clock runs out. So let's stop for a second and ask the question many viewers are already thinking. What would a big deal actually mean in practical terms? It could mean a broad agreement in which Iran accepts verifiable limits tied to nuclear activity, distances itself from support for armed proxy groups, and receives a pathway toward economic normalization. Could mean sanctions relief tied to strict compliance. It could mean security guarantees, direct or indirect understandings about regional conduct, and some kind of diplomatic architecture designed to reduce the chance of military escalation. But here is the catch. For the United States, a big deal would need to be strong enough to look enforceable. For Iran, it would need to be respectful enough to look sovereign. Those two conditions do not naturally fit together. They have to be engineered. And that is where most diplomatic dreams go to die. But what happened next may be even more revealing. Vance made clear that whether direct negotiations continue depends on Iran. That statement matters because it shifts the burden publicly toward Tehran. It tells the audience, both domestic and international, that Washington is presenting itself as willing to engage, while suggesting that the real test of seriousness now lies with Iran's response. That kind of framing is classic diplomatic positioning. Creates pressure. It shapes headlines. It narrows the room for the other side to walk away without appearing responsible for the collapse. Yet it can also backfire because the other side may see it as blame management rather than trust building. Now the middle of this story brings us to the real twist. For all the dramatic language about a big agreement, the most explosive truth may be this. Both sides appear to want negotiations, but they may want fundamentally different victories out of those negotiations. The United States wants a result that shuts down the most dangerous security threats and redefines Iran's role. Iran wants a deal that protects its dignity, limits outside pressure, and avoids surrendering strategic leverage. That means both parties may be sincere about wanting talks while still being incompatible on what success actually looks like. And that is the paradox at the heart of this entire crisis. Because a negotiation can survive bad chemistry. It can survive long sessions, tactical disputes, and public criticism. But when both sides are chasing different endgames under the same banner of diplomacy, every apparent step forward may hide a deeper fracture. One side may think it is building the road to settlement. The other may think it is simply managing pressure while preserving core advantages. That is why optimism alone does not tell us much. The real question is whether the gap between public language and actual red lines is narrowing, or just being temporarily covered by hopeful rhetoric. And now we arrive at the human dimension, the part that often gets buried under strategic jargon. When leaders talk about nuclear policy, sanctions, proxy groups, or legal frameworks, the world hears the language of states. But ordinary people hear something else. They hear risk, instability, prices, fear. Families in the region hear the possibility of another escalation hanging over their future. Iranian citizens hear talk of prosperity and integration into the global economy. But many have heard promises before. Americans hear that their leadership wants to prevent nuclear danger and regional chaos, but they also know how quickly overseas crises can pull the United States into deeper conflict. Behind every phrase in this negotiation is a very simple emotional truth. Millions of people want relief from a cycle that never seems to end. That is why the contrast in this story is so powerful. On one side, you have the vision being sold, no nuclear weapon, no sponsorship of armed groups, economic opportunity, regional peace. On the other side, you have the reality. 21 hours of talks with no agreement on core issues. A ceasefire nearing expiration. Mistrust so deep that even the negotiators openly admit it cannot be solved quickly. Vision and reality. Promise and obstruction. Hope and suspicion. That contrast is what keeps this story alive. And here is another question worth asking. Why Pakistan? If the negotiations continue there, the location itself sends a message. Pakistan is not just a neutral backdrop. A host country can shape tone, provide political cover, and help create enough distance for adversaries to speak without appearing to concede too much publicly. Sometimes the setting matters almost as much as the agenda. When diplomatic talks move to carefully chosen venues, it is often because the participants need a controlled environment to test possibilities that would be harder to explore in more exposed settings. That does not guarantee progress, but it suggests that the choreography of these talks is being taken seriously. Still, serious choreography does not erase the hardest issue: enrichment. For Iran, the ability to enrich uranium has long been presented as a sovereign right and a symbol of scientific and strategic independence. For the United States, any capacity that appears close to weapons potential becomes a direct security concern. The disagreement is not simply technical. It is ideological, symbolic, and deeply political. Every proposal around enrichment is loaded with competing interpretations. A limit can be seen as a safeguard by one side and a humiliation by the other. A concession can be seen as responsible statecraft by one side and dangerous weakness by the other. That is why talks on this subject are so often exhausting, repetitive, and fragile. And then there is Hormuz. Even the mention of control over the Strait of Hormuz immediately raises the tension level because the strait is not a local issue. It is global. Energy markets, shipping security, insurance costs, strategic deterrence, naval positioning, everything around that corridor echoes far beyond the region. If the United States and Iran are openly at odds over Hormuz in the context of these talks, then this is not a narrow nuclear negotiation. It is a negotiation tied to the architecture of regional power itself. And once a negotiation touches that level, compromise becomes much harder because neither side wants to appear weakened in front of allies, rivals, or the international market. This is where the suspense deepens. Because from the outside, people often assume diplomacy moves in a straight line. First contact, then bargaining, then deal or no deal. But real diplomacy often moves in loops. Public optimism can hide private deadlock. A failed round can quietly produce useful understanding. A promising session can unravel over one phrase. Sometimes the breakthrough comes right after the conversation looks doomed. And sometimes the smiles come just before the collapse. That is why the story is so hard to read. Every signal points in two directions at once. Vance says Tehran likely wants an agreement. Pezeshkian says Iran is ready for a balanced and fair one. Trump says another round could happen soon. The first talks were long and serious. All of that sounds like momentum, but the disputes remain massive, the mistrust remains structural, and time remains short. That sounds like danger. So which is it, momentum or danger? The answer may be both. And perhaps the most surprising element of all is the scale of the ambition being discussed publicly. Most diplomatic efforts begin by shrinking expectations. Leaders lower the temperature, define modest goals, and leave room for partial success. But here, the rhetoric is moving in the opposite direction. Vance is talking about a big deal. Trump is reportedly pushing toward a larger vision that can energize diplomacy because bold goals sometimes create the pressure needed to think beyond stale formulas. But it can also destabilize diplomacy because the more transformative the goal, the more each side fears the final cost. So now imagine the next few days. A second round begins. Vance returns to the table. Witkoff joins. Kushner is present. Iran arrives ready to defend its rights while projecting reasonableness. The Americans arrive determined to lock in a strong commitment on nuclear non-development and broader regional behavior. The room is heavy with history. Every statement is measured. Every pause matters. And hanging over all of it is the possibility that one side sees this as the last best chance for de-escalation, while the other sees it as one round in a much longer contest. That is the kind of environment where history can shift unexpectedly, or harden permanently. Now let's talk about the climax of this story, the point where everything sharpens. The most important revelation is not simply that Trump wants a major agreement, or that Vance feels optimistic, or that Iran says it is open to fairness. The most important revelation is that both sides are now speaking in terms that suggest they understand the stakes have become bigger than a temporary arrangement. They are talking about long-term peace, long-term security, global economic integration, nuclear red lines, regional conduct, and legal legitimacy. That means the framework of the discussion has expanded. This is no longer being framed as a transaction. It is being framed as a possible redefinition of the relationship itself. And that is the most dangerous part, because once you frame something that large, failure becomes more consequential. If a narrow confidence-building measure fails, disappointment is limited. But if a potential historic reset fails, the political and emotional backlash can be enormous. Hawks on all. Sides feel vindicated. Moderates lose credibility. Military calculations become more aggressive. The next crisis becomes easier to trigger because the last chance for diplomacy is seen as wasted. That is why every word in this moment feels heavier than usual. But there is still one more uncomfortable truth. Even if a broad agreement were somehow reached, that would not mean trust had suddenly been restored. It would only mean both sides found a structure strong enough to function despite mistrust. And maybe that is the real lesson here. Peace between adversaries is rarely born from affection. It is born from calculation, fear of worse outcomes, and a shared recognition that the alternative is more costly. So when Vance admits trust cannot be fixed quickly, he may be revealing the only realistic path forward. Not friendship, not sudden reconciliation, but an arrangement built on hard interests and hard verification. That may not sound romantic. It may not sound inspiring. But in the real world, that is often how history changes. Not with dramatic hugs, not with perfect understanding, but with two rivals deciding, however reluctantly, that the price of failure has become too high. And maybe that is why this story has captured so much attention, because it contains two completely different futures at once. In one future, the United States and Iran push through the mistrust, outline the bones of a credible agreement, and begin reducing one of the most dangerous tensions in global politics. In the other future, the talks stall, the ceasefire expires, the core disputes over uranium and Hormuz grow sharper, and the language of diplomacy is replaced again by the language of confrontation. Right now, both futures are still alive. That is what makes this moment feel so tense. So where does that leave us tonight? It leaves us watching a negotiation that is larger than a headline, more fragile than public statements suggest, and more consequential than many people realize. J.D. Vance has put the message on the table. Trump wants a big deal with Iran. Iran says it is open to a fair one. Another round may be just days away. But under the surface, the deepest obstacles remain. Exactly where they have always been: trust, power, rights, leverage, and the question of who must give up what first. And that is why this story is not over. In fact, it may just be entering its most decisive phase. The next round of talks, if it happens, will not simply test negotiating skill. It will test whether ambition can survive reality, whether public optimism can survive private red lines, whether two capitals shaped by years of suspicion can still produce something that neither side fully trusts but both sides can live with. That is the puzzle. That is the suspense. And that is why the world is paying attention. Because sometimes history changes with explosions. And sometimes it changes in closed rooms, through long hours of difficult conversation, while the rest of the world waits outside wondering whether it is about to witness a breakthrough or a breakdown. What do you think? Is this the first real opening toward a major US-Iran agreement? Or just another round of high-stakes diplomacy destined to collapse under the weight of mistrust? Drop your view in the comments. And if you want deep, cinematic breakdowns of the world's biggest stories as they unfold, subscribe and stay with us, because the next move in this story could change everything.